Kia ora, g'day, welcome back once again. Here with something a little different, but something that has been playing on my mind for a little bit, actually. And it's in regards to this gift that I was given, this book, We Were Soldiers Once, 2 Special Air Service Regiment, New Zealand Squadron, the New Zealand Originals, a pictorial diary by Ross M. Cameron. So that's the front cover there. I was given this by a former police officer here in NZ, been kind enough to follow my channel, goes by the handle Charlie29. So shout out to you, brother. Thank you very much. And he dropped around home one day, dropped this off along with a donut. He put his squiggle in the book. And I believe these are the medals of the person, Ross M. Cameron. Now, there's clearly a lot of history in here. There's pictures, there's words, there's some stories and things like that. And I've had a bit of a squiz through this book. Obviously haven't read it in its entirety, but I'd like to, and I'm going to just start reading through it on here. Now, I've tried to reach out to the author, I believe, Ross Cameron, because it's got details in that in here. Now, I'm not going to show those details or read them out on here. I don't know how old these details are, but I've reached out to the email that's on here. It hasn't bounced back, so I assume that the email is still valid. Just asking permission if it would be okay. I haven't received anything back, so I'm going to read through it anyway and share it, just because I think it's some cool history in here, stuff that I definitely didn't know, stuff that I still don't know, and I don't know how many of these books there are out there. I don't know how many copies exist or are in circulation. And maybe it's of interest to people that like to know about or learn a bit more about some of NZ's history and role and some of the things that have happened in the past. So I am going to use some license and do some reading and stuff of it. If Mr. Cameron or his family have objections or anything like that and they reach out or they tell me to stop, then I'll gladly do that. I'll stop. If they ask me to take down the readings that I put up on the channel, I'll gladly take those down. So I've got no issue with that. Hence why I tried to reach out to him first, wanted to ask, because there are obviously copyright things that are mentioned in here. And so I don't want to upset the apple cart or annoy Mr. Cameron or his family through reading through this book and putting it on the channel. So yeah, I'll just put that disclaimer out there first. But anyway, I'm going to start reading and then we'll see where it lands. And if I get complaints from the family or from Mr. Cameron himself, I'll apologize in advance and reach out to him and make a proper apology. And I'll gladly take them down, as I've said. But in the meantime, I'll put these up. Hopefully there aren't any issues. And maybe one day when I eventually get through this book, reading through it, there might be a bit of a digital record, for want of a better term, for people to have a listen to or whatever. If anything, my boring monotone voice might help put you to sleep at night. if you're struggling to get to sleep, you might, what can I listen to get to sleep? Oh yeah, I'll listen to this fella. So anyway, that's the cover. I've read that and we'll get into it. From Charlie29 to Joe, thanks for your service. Appreciate you, bro. Thank you very much. And New Zealand Special Air Service Squadron 1955 to 1957. It's got on the inside of this page. I'll show screenshots of the pages that I'm reading as I go through. The New Zealand Originals, a pictorial diary. This saga, Once We Were Soldiers, is an unofficial story and chronicles the formation, the successful life and early demise of the original NZSAS Squadron deployed into the jungles of Malaya in 1955 to 57. This is a soldier story about soldiers. Ross M. Cameron. So apologies, I'll probably mispronounce a bunch of stuff in here as well. My apologies in advance. The badges and medals that I showed earlier, which I believe are Mr. Cameron's badges: upper SAS Regimental Badge, middle SAS Parachutist Wings, Service Medals from left to right: Operational Service Medal, New Zealand; General Service Medal 1936 UK with clasp Malaya; Defence Service Medal, New Zealand with clasp Regular; and Pingat Jasa Malaysia Medal, Malaysia. So, yep, I'm going to be messing up a whole bunch of things. Apologies for that. Dedication. This work is dedicated to the special service soldier, past, present, and future, and especially to those young soldiers who made this story possible. It's a cool little tribute there, dedication. The contents, I'm not going to read through all of that because there's a bunch of stuff in there. I'll put some screenshots up. We'll get into the foreword. By Captain Graham Boswell, Adjutant NZSAS Squadron, Malaya, 1955 to 57. Boswell, my OC in Victor Company 1R and ZIR when I got to 1st Battalion in the New Zealand Army was Major Boswell, John Boswell. I think he might still be in the New Zealand Defence Force today, but he was my OC for Victor Company at the time. So it must be a relative of his, I'm guessing. At the 1954 Commonwealth Prime Minister's Conference in London, the suggestion was put to the Right Honourable Sidney Holland, then the Prime Minister of New Zealand, that New Zealand contributes an SAS squadron to the Commonwealth Reserve, being arranged in the Far East to support SEATO. I don't know what that stands for, but I'll have a look for it later. The squadron could also be available to assist the emergency created in Malaya by the Malayan Communist Party, which was then in its 9th year. The 22nd Special Air Service Regiment had been formed in Malaya several years earlier with the express role of attacking the communist terrorists in their bases in the deep jungle. The regiment comprised 5 squadrons, including one drawn from the British Parachute Regiment and one from Rhodesia. It was suggested that New Zealand could replace the latter, which was shortly due to depart, having completed its 2-year tour of duty. The Prime Minister accepted the British suggestion and on his way home inspected Tutu SAS at their headquarters at Coronation Park, Kuala Lumpur. Back in Wellington, it was decided that the squadron would be largely recruited from civilians, with a cadre of regular officers and NCOs. One territorial officer was included. Wow, so largely recruited from civilians. Major Frank Rennie, a regular infantry officer with service in the Pacific and Italy during World War II, was appointed squadron commander and authorised to select his own officers and NCOs down to and including the rank of corporal. On the 7th of June 1955, those selected from the hundreds that had applied to join the squadron marched into Waiouru camp to begin a punishing training schedule that would eventually turn them into the best trained unit ever to leave New Zealand. The advance party had preceded the main body by several weeks in order to prepare the accommodation and other administrative details. On their arrival in Malaya, the standard of training of the squadron impressed even the British in the regiment of which they now formed a part. But their training was not yet over, and before the squadron was committed to operations, it was put through a rigorous course of jungle training under experienced British officers and NCOs, and then a parachute course at the RAF Far East Parachute School in Changi, Singapore. Changi? Something like that. Sorry. In Singapore, anyway. Before being committed to their operational role, the squadron undertook a limited shakedown operation in the deep jungle of Pahung between Kuala Krau and the gold mining town of Raub, about 150 miles east and slightly north of Kuala Lumpur. The 5-week operation failed to make any contact with the CT, communist terrorists, but proved a very useful experience during which the squadron was able to test its operational procedures. The individual members came to terms with working in jungle conditions and finding their way over terrain where visibility was seldom more than a few yards and the trees, with their canopies up to 200 feet above the ground, hid the sun. Holy heck. Hang on, let me just get that out of the road. In the beginning of April 1956, the squadron was committed to an operation in the area of Fort Brooke in the Cameron Highlands area of Perak State, which lasted 10 weeks. Then, after a break, a similar operation of about 13 weeks in the same area. The aim of these operations was to break up the communist terrorists organization in that area and to win the cooperation of the Aborigines. Aborigines, I'm guessing in this case just meaning the local indigenous people. In this, the squadron was very successful, eliminating the terrorist leader Ah Ming and a number of his followers and establishing a rapport with the little tribesmen. At the end of that year, and until October 1957, the squadron was deployed to Negri Sembilan, where a group under the leadership of Li Hak-chi was proving rather troublesome. Into the new year and until October, the squadron patrolled the rugged terrain within the triangle formed by the roads joining Seremban, Kuala Pilar, and Tampin. Li Hak-chi had been killed and most of his organization eliminated by the time the squadron withdrew from the area, this time to return home. The return to New Zealand was carried out in 4 flights by Hastings aircraft of the Royal New Zealand Air Force. The squadron had spent 18 of the 24 months it was in Malaya in the jungle. Holy heck. So the squadron spent 18 of the 24 months it was in Malaya in the jungle. It's a long time. During this time, 23 terrorists were eliminated and the communist terrorist infrastructure destroyed in the areas where the squadron had been deployed. Significant success had been made in winning the hearts and minds of the Aborigines, I assume the local indigenous peoples. The squadron had also made a useful contribution to their parent unit, the 22nd SAS Regiment. That's cool. That was to move on to achieve fame as one of the world's great counter-terrorist organisations. On return to New Zealand, the New Zealand squadron was disbanded and had to wait for several years before, through efforts of its former commander, it was reinstated in the Army's Permanent Order of Battle. Wow. Interesting. So, majority of civilians made up of Major Frank Rennie put in charge, conducting all the training, going through doing that of the 24 months, 18 months in the jungle, and then disbanded shortly after. And then through the efforts of its former commander, I'm assuming Major Frank Rennie, it was then reinstated. Wow, that's the foreword. The preface: the end of the Second World War in 1945 had seen the destruction of one totalitarian regime in Central Europe, namely Nazi Germany, only to have another rise in its place in East Europe, the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, commonly known as Soviet Russia. By the late 1940s, there was an armed standoff between the Communist Soviet Union with its eastern satellites and the Democratic United States of America with its western allies. With the ever-present possibility of a Third World War and a nuclear holocaust, this became known as the Cold War. This tension finally boiled over into open conflict in the divided country of Korea when Communist North Korea, backed by the newly Communist People's Republic of China, invaded the democratic South Korea in 1950. With the defeat of Japan at the end of World War II, the Japanese province of Korea had been divided along the 38th parallel into the newly Communist North Korea and the newly democratic South Korea. The West, in the form of the United States of America and the United Nations, rallied to the defense of South Korea and provided military assistance. New Zealand's contribution was K-Force, which consisted of a battery of medium field artillery from the 16th Field Regiment, RNZA, and a transport company from 10 Transport Company, Royal New Zealand ASC. I don't know what that is. RNZ ASC. Anyway, including a light aid detachment, a signals troop, and 2 frigates from the Royal New Zealand Navy. Wow. In 1953, a ceasefire was negotiated, which has created a standoff stalemate that has left both sides glaring at each other over the armistice table on the demarcation line at Panmunjom. This standoff is still going on today between these two Koreas, 64 years after the ceasefire. From 1954, New Zealand only retained a small transport element in Korea for a short period. Wow. My early informative teens had been fashioned by the events of World War II, so that I had developed an affinity with the armed forces. I had been interested in volunteering for New Zealand's K-Force in 1950, but as I was in the middle of my engineering apprenticeship, I decided that completing this was a first priority. By the mid-1950s, I was a journeyman working in the foundry of a local engineering firm in Martin. The work was production work, repetitious, dirty, and monotonous. Life had become somewhat humdrum to work each day, after which one had a few beers with one's mates between 5 and 6 p.m. in the local pub, to be thrown out at 6 p.m. somewhat the worse for wear. This was the era of 6 o'clock closing, known as the 6 o'clock swill, a World War I restriction which had never been removed. Evenings spent at the local movie house, rugby practice, or sneaking into the back bar of a pub after hours, hoping that the police wouldn't mount a raid. Weekends spent fishing from a mate's boat off Kapiti Island, or surf casting off local beaches. This interspersed with outings with the motorcycle club at time trials, miniature TTs or rallies, etc. Periodically, there would be a dance on Saturday night with the current girlfriend. To a young man, life was predictable with more of the same in the future. Wow. By 1954, I decided that I wanted to see something of the world, have some adventure, and get paid for it. So I resurrected my idea of joining the army and going to Korea. Naturally, like many young men, my dream had been to be a fighter pilot, but I also knew that I didn't have the brains or ability to that. You're not the only one. I definitely didn't have any brains for that. Also, by this time, the ceasefire was in place, and Korea was a lot safer place. There was an element of patriotism in this, but this was quite small. Finally, one day in January 1955, I hopped on my motorbike and went across to the Army recruiting office in Wanganui. The recruiting sergeant told me that Korea was finished, but they had a new airborne unit going to Malaya in the near future. The airborne part didn't appeal to me much because in the end, Korea, Malaya, what the hell? So I signed, The airborne part didn't appeal to me much, but in the end, Korea, Malaya, what the hell? So I signed on the dotted line. My application for enlistment in the new unit was accepted. So on the evening of the 6th of June 1955, I found myself standing on the platform of the Martin railway station, waiting for the night express to take me to Waiodu to start training. Also waiting for this train was a local acquaintance, Bob Cairncross, who had also volunteered for the New Zealand's 1st Special Air Service Squadron, NZSAS Squadron. Bob had an advantage over me in that he had very recently completed his requirement with the Compulsory Military Training Scheme, CMT, and had recent experience in matters military. I did not have that insight. Neither of us knew anything about SAS, my only knowledge being through Commando war comics, where the sergeant always won the war. Neither of us knew what we had let ourselves in for, but we were soon to find out. Okay, sorry, the preface still is carrying on, so I'll carry on reading this as well. The young men who volunteered for the squadron came from all walks of society, most of them having had some military experience. This experience ranged from veterans of the Second World War. One had fought at Arnhem with the British Parachute Regiment, and one had fought in Greece and had been a prisoner of war, illegally in a Nazi Gestapo concentration camp. The OC had seen action in the Pacific and Italy, and the SSM in Italy, including the battles of Cassino and the Sangro. Others had served in the occupation of Japan, the war in Korea, and many had come through CMT, what's that, compulsory military training, and many had come through the compulsory military training. 3 were ex-Navy. The officers and NCOs came from regular and territorial forces, with some taking a reduction in rank to join. Most of the other ranks were recruited from the civilian population. A few like me had only limited experience in the school cadet system during the mid-1940s. Wow. Big mix there, but also sounds like a heck of a lot of experience with regards to some of those that had been fighting in conflicts prior to taking part in what they were about to embark on. The SAS soldier is seen by many to be a superman. This notion being prevalent not only within the civilian population, but also with many in the military. That's true. Actually, maybe not true. They're definitely highly regarded. I don't think I ever saw them as supermen, but I saw them as, I saw them as heroes anyway when I was in the military, and people to respect was how I looked at them. This work attempts to show that these young men were not supermen, awesome, but average young men who had drive and initiative. That is an excellent way, I think, in my opinion, of summing that up. But average young men who had drive and initiative. They volunteered to do a job which was generally strenuous, often dangerous, and mostly monotonous. Like soldiers from time immemorial, they had to contend not only with the enemy, the environment, and jungle conditions, but also their own fears, and to see the job through to a successful conclusion. They soldiered hard and played hard like most soldiers. In general, they were successful, but they also made their mistakes. They had their ups and downs like anybody else, but they enjoyed a strong, I don't know how to pronounce that, joie de vivre, Joie is the first word, then DE, then VIVRE. Is that French? I don't know. And also a developed, a very strong esprit de corps. These unchanged to this day, 60 years on. This unit was only a small unit from a small nation in a small war in a small country, but it played an active but small part in world-shaking events, i.e. the battle against communist world domination, the Cold War. The norm in these great events is that the politicians and the generals get all the kudos and are remembered for good or ill by history, but the majority of the people who make that history possible seldom get a mention on an individual level. Yeah, that's true. But I think for the most part, those that probably sign up to take part in these aren't looking for an individual mention. But I like, if that's part of what Mr. Cameron's intent is of this book, I like that he's trying to capture some of that here, which is a part of why I want to read this out and just, I don't know, like have a digital footprint, like I said. Up until now, little has been written about this unit and nothing in depth. In short, it is the forgotten in a forgotten war. I see a loose parallel with the Roman 9th Legion in Britain around AD 83. It marched into Scotland to subdue the recalcitrant Scottish clansmen and disappeared without trace. No sign of it has been found since. Wow. Similarly, the NZSAS squadron disappeared in AD 1957, but at least it returned home to disappear through politics, not war. It is often asked, who were these people? Where did they come from? Where did they go? Many of them stayed in the army and soldiered on to retirement, while others returned to civilian occupations. Some moved overseas, although most stayed in NZ. Like most men, members of this squadron have experienced the joys and tribulations of marriage and families. Most have been successful in their endeavours and in society. They suffer the same health problems as their peers, although members of this unit seem to suffer a higher incidence of back and lower limb problems per capita than normal. I have attempted to answer the above questions in part by including profiles of a cross-section of some of those still serving and of some who have passed on. That's cool. While on operations, the 5 troops in the New Zealand squadron operated separately in the jungle areas, many miles apart, and only rarely did they come together. It was when a squadron came off operations to go on leave, then to base duties and retraining, that the personnel mixed freely with each other. This situation also applied to all the 5 squadrons of the regiment. Over our 2-year tour of duty in Malaya, it was very rare to have 2 squadrons in the regimental base in Kuala Lumpur at the same time, and because of this, interaction between the squadrons was minimal. However, the men in other squadrons taught us a thing or two about jungle warfare when we first arrived. In turn, we modified some of their techniques and introduced new ones of our own, which we were able to pass on to them, adding to the overall success of the regiment. Ross M. Cameron, ex-trooper, NZ Squadron, 22SAS Regiment, Malaya, 1955 to 57. Wow. So that's the foreword and the preface so far. I'm going to carry on reading. The SAS, A Brief History. During World War II, a young British subaltern, Second Lieutenant David Sterling, was convalescing in Cairo from injuries. Is it convalescing? Yeah, convalescing in Cairo from injuries incurred in action in North Africa while serving with Number 8 Commando. He came up with the concept of using small groups of highly trained men to stealthily penetrate by land or air, parachute, deep behind enemy lines, there to operate independently for long periods of time. His idea was that these groups would create havoc and destruction in the enemy's rear, especially his airfields, and disrupt his lines of communication. He calculated that these small groups would be more economically effective than large, expensive squadrons of bombers. Taking the concept of what was to become the regimental motto, "Who dares wins," he bypassed the usual military chain of command and tried to directly approach the GOC, Middle East, General Auchinleck with his idea. Needless to say, he wasn't too popular with his immediate superiors. However, he finally got to the deputy commanding officer, Lieutenant General Ritchie. The general liked the idea, and from this, in 1941, was born our detachment of No. 8 Commando under the command of the now Captain David Stirling. This soon became the 1st Special Air Service SAS Regiment, the name being designed to confuse the enemy into believing that the British had brought a full airborne unit to the Middle East initially. Initially, the unit comprised 6 officers and 60 NCOs and other ranks. To give pride of unit, a competition was held within the new unit to design a badge and wings. The wings were designed by Lieutenant Jock Lewis, later killed in action. Lewis, based on the wings of Egypt as seen in the foyer of the Shepherd's Hotel in Cairo. The design of the badge was by Sergeant Bob Tate, MM, and Bar, which he called the Flaming Sword of Excalibur. This being used on the legend of Queen Guinevere presenting the Sword of Truth to King Arthur. The Flaming Sword, incorrectly also known as the Winged Dagger. There you go. I am and have always been 100% guilty of calling it the Winged Dagger. Sandy Brand Winged Dagger. I think I've always referred to it as that. But here we have the Flaming Sword. That's what it is. Incorrectly also became known as the Winged Dagger. My apologies for that. Flaming Sword, I will probably still call it the Winged Dagger. But it's good to have that knowledge now. Captain David Stirling added the motto, "Who dares wins." The colours of the badge and wings were decided by David Stirling and his 2IC, Lieutenant Blair Paddy Mayne, the legend, or both legends. From the blues of the universities of Cambridge, Stirling, and Oxford, Maine. And for headgear, a sand-coloured beret was adopted. Initially, the wings were worn on the left breast, but are now worn on the right upper arm. The SAS badge and the SAS wings. Wow. Later, an offshoot was born from the SAS regiment called the Special Boat Service, SBS, which undertook largely marine-borne covert operations against the occupying Germans and Italians in the islands of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Adriatic. When the war moved into Europe, the 1 SAS regiment became involved in Italy and France, at which time a 2nd SAS regiment, 2 SAS, was formed. During this period, the Belgians and French also formed SAS units. These SAS units served in France and Northern Europe in the SAS Brigade under the command of Brigadier J.M. Calvert. Following the end of the war, and with the reorganisation of the British Armed Forces, the SBS became part of the Royal Marine Commandos, and the SAS was disbanded, except for a Territorial Army TA regiment that was retained as 21 SAS TA, Artists' Rifles, based in London. The Artists' Rifles was formed in the 19th century as a London TA regiment, which was manned by volunteers from the artistic, theatrical, and legal elements of central London. Interesting. The regiment saw active service in both the Boer War and World War I, where it earned a number of battle honours. In World War II, it didn't go out of the UK, but trained officers and NCOs who were passed on to other line regiments. For political reasons at the time, 21 SAS, being a London TA regiment, became affiliated with the Artists' Rifles TA. And it's got a reference down the bottom. How's that for time? I'll read this last part. In 1950, an SAS squadron was formed in the British African colony of Rhodesia for service with the Malayan Scouts, SAS, in the Malayan emergency. Malayan Scouts (SAS) in the Malayan emergency. In 1952, the title of Malayan Scouts was dropped, and the 22nd SAS Regiment was born in Malaya. In 1955, at a suggestion of the British government, New Zealand formed an SAS squadron and Australia followed in 1957. In 1960, another territorial SAS regiment was formed in the UK, the 23 SAS TA, based in Manchester. Excuse me. The three British regiments retained the original badge and wings, but at this stage of their evolution, adopted the red beret of the British Airborne Forces, as did the New Zealand and Australian squadrons. Oh, interesting. Some years later, the traditional sand-coloured beret was reinstated. All right. That's 30 minutes. I'm going to leave that there. But I've enjoyed reading this, learning a bit along the way. The flaming sword, not the winged dagger, the flaming sword of Excalibur. But yeah. Anyway, let me know your thoughts. There's probably a whole bunch of other people out there that are historians. I'm not a historian by any means. I'm just reading through what's in the book as per what is written. Apologies for my mispronunciation of likely a heck of a lot of words. Apologies in advance. There's going to be more to come if you happen to listen to me reading through this. But hopefully some people or somebody finds it interesting. And yeah, and hopefully more people have an opportunity, like I'm getting, to learn more about the originals. And I love the questions and stuff that Mr. Cameron has put in there in his attempts to try to answer some of these questions. Who were these people? Where did they come from? Where did they go? You know, and he talks about some of the issues and challenges that they have, which are pretty similar to those even to this day. So appreciate your time and your support. If you stuck around this long, if you listened to me reading through this, I've got plenty more to read. I've only read this little bit over here. So, and we're not even into the actual chapters of anything yet. It's more been foreword, preface, and that sort of stuff. But thank you again for your time. As always, the message is the same. Any challenges, difficulties, trials that you may be going through, just encourage you to keep turning up, keep staying in the fight, put one foot in front of the other, and take one day at a time. Know and trust that things can do and will get better if you want them to. Just got to stay consistent, be stubborn, be kinder to yourself, and sometimes we've got to be patient with it as well. So, as always, go always a little further. Remember, who dares wins and who cares wins. And until the next video, there's a big mana wave coming from me to you, filled with my aroha, respect, appreciation, and gratitude for you all.